All right, we're going to talk about disaster recovery planning. Now, most of what we need to cover in disaster recovery planning is we've already talked about it. Identifying what disasters are, things like natural disasters and man-made disasters and all of that stuff. So that's all a part of, the concept of disaster recovery plans. But once you've identified what those disasters are, you need to figure out what you're going to do in response. And once you've figured out what you're going to do in response, which is all kind of part of business continuity planning, you need to do it. When the disaster happens, you need to do it. So really, the disaster recovery plan is for when the worst has happened, the natural disaster has happened, the tornado hits your building, your city's having riots, and you need to figure out something to do. What do you do? And it's very, very closely related to business continuity planning. In fact, it's hard to really tell where one starts and the other one ends, or where one ends and the other begins, because they're both really related to the idea of identifying what might happen to your organization, what might happen to interrupt your business, figuring out how you're going to respond to that, and then responding. So what do you do? Once you've performed the business impact analysis, you figured out what your most important assets are, you have your alternative sites identified and set up, whether it's a hot site or a cold site or a warm site, the tornado has come, then what? So it's kind of walking through this process, and all of the this process should be a part of your disaster recovery plan. Written down steps that say, okay, here's what we do first, here's what we do second. Make sure all our people are alive and taken care of. Remembering that people are the most valuable asset of most organizations. I would say all, but you never know. And so you've got the plan. Here's what you do first. You have to recognize, hey, we are in a disaster recovery situation. We have had something happen. We need to activate the disaster recovery plan, pull out the binders, figure out what you need to do, move forward with that. Implement your contingencies. Do whatever it is that you need to do. Recover those systems. That's a part of the plan. Recovering from backups, building up your site, getting your hot site, warm site, whatever site up and running. Recovering those systems in whatever order is most critical, identifying what systems are most important should be done beforehand so that when the disaster comes, you've already figured out what needs to come up and when. Test those recovered systems. So once you've got things up and running in a functional situation, make sure that they're up and running the right way and you've got things going. And then afterwards, after you've recovered, then you need to have some sort of after action report, some sort of postmortem where you say, okay, here's what happened. Here's how it went. Here's where we could have used maybe more direction. Here's what went really well. Here's what we need to do differently next time. And update your disaster recovery plan as a result of what you find. So it's important before the disaster happens that you test the plan. Because just like with a backup, if you are not testing your backups, it's going to fail and you're not going to find out until it's too late. Well, if you have a disaster recovery plan and you're not testing it, it's not going to work and you're not going to know it until the disaster happens, and then is not the best time to figure that out. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can test a disaster recovery plan with varying levels of expense and complexity. So the read through is just, hey, we're going to read through the steps and think about it. Think, hey, are we missing anything? Really just kind of making it a mental checklist and trying to make sure you're not missing anything purely by reading through the disaster recovery plan. You could do a tabletop exercise where you're mostly sitting around in a circle. You're maybe coming up with a scenario, or maybe not coming up with, maybe just kind of talking through a disaster, mentally simulating the process of working through these things, saying, hey, okay, we've got the server up and running, just in your head. You've got the server up and running, and hey, we've got restored from backups. We've got the backups from over here. Playing it almost like a board game, but not quite, because it's not very fun. But you're making sure that things are working. A simulation is where you simulate a scenario. So it's a little bit of a step above a tabletop exercise, but in the tabletop exercise, in the simulation, it's a little bit more than a tabletop exercise because you're simulating a specific disaster in kind of the same scenario, in the same kind of tabletop exercise situation. You have some sort of disaster strikes. You say, oh, our data center flooded. How do we respond? What do we do? Who does what? When? How does this all work? Still kind of in that tabletop exercise scenario, but you might do some stuff. You might actually practice recovering. You might move some data, restore some data onto a server somewhere to make sure things are working. Again, kind of just part of testing this out and make sure not just that the procedures are sound, but that the technical aspects are going to work the way that you need them to. In the case of a parallel test, what you're going to do is actually go through the process of spinning up your servers, getting your business up and running, getting computers up and running, getting everything that you need working, restoring everything from backups, getting everything up and going, without doing the full process of switching over to the new site, the backup site. So you're getting everything ready as if you were about to switch it over, and then you stop just before you switch it over so that you don't actually interrupt your business. Your main servers stay running and everything just keeps going kind of the way it normally would without interruption, except for the fact that that people are working over at the parallel site getting things up and running. And then finally, the full interruption. This is the hardcorest of all hardcore tests. This is where you actually pull your live operations over to your backup site. And it's the most complete test, and it's the most expensive test, and it's the most risky test. But it's the only way that you're really going to be absolutely sure that everything is working at the backup site the way that it should. So you're moving your actual live operations to backup servers, to the backup workstations, to the backup everything, to be positive that everything there is going to work exactly the way that you want to. And then you can switch everything back over. So again, that's pretty risky and time consuming and expensive, but it has the benefit of full live testing, which is more than you'll get with any of the other tests. So this is a video from Parks and Rec. It's about a minute long. If you search for avian flu Parks and Rec, you can watch this video, which is an example of a tabletop exercise where they were working through what they would do, working through their emergency and disaster recovery planning in a simulated emergency situation. So it's a simulation tabletop exercise. And finally, one thing I want to talk about is the principle of chaos. And this is something that's come out of software testing, and it's come out of testing backups and things, and building reliable and available systems. And Netflix created a piece of software called the Chaos Monkey. And the purpose of the Chaos Monkey is to randomly take down their servers, their live production servers. The idea being to make sure that their systems and their processes are reliable and failovers work, and they are chaos proof, that they work when things fail, when a server goes down, when things happen. And they have built their infrastructure in such a way that they can handle that kind of chaos. And they use the Chaos Monkey to go through and take out servers, and it takes out resources out of their live environment. So you might have had a server that you were watching a movie with taken out from under you, and hopefully you never noticed, because the idea is that their systems will work and continue to function even if that happens. And the Principles of Chaos is a website that kind of talks about what the principles are and how that works. And the idea applies to disaster recovery. It applies to backups. It applies to all of these things that we talk about with business continuity planning, because it's the idea that you can't plan for everything. And so you need to make sure that your processes, especially for the types of chaos that are most commonly going to hit you, that you're prepared and that you're ready and that you know that your processes are going to work when they need to work. And the only way to do that in this case is to do real live testing in their production environment. And that's disaster recovery planning, and how to use a disaster recovery plan and how to test a disaster recovery plan.